Okay, chapter 20 is diseases of the digestive system. So the digestive system has several names. You can either call it digestive system, you can call it the gastrointestinal system or the gastrointestinal tract, or you can call it the enteric tract. That one's not as common, but if you've had AMP1 or AMP2, you've maybe heard enteric system before. Either one of those is fine. Either way, the digestive system is basically one long tube that goes from the mouth all the way through the anus, where we have input of food and water. That's main job is to break down those molecules and absorb those nutrients. Now there are 8 main sections of the overall digestive tract and then 4 accessory organs that their job is going to be to add digestive fluids and enzymes to help in the process of digestion. So the 8 main sections are going to be the mouth, the pharynx, the esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, rectum, and anus from start to finish. And then those 4 accessory organs are the salivary glands, the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. So the digestive tract has tons of microbes that it encounters every single day, numbering in the millions every single day. Most of these are going to be commensal, some of them are beneficial and hang around, some of them don't. Others are going to be those pathogens that can possibly make us sick. So because of the sheer volume of microbes, we also have a lot of defenses in the digestive system. For example, all of those intestinal surfaces are going to be coated in mucus, and this is going to provide a mechanical or a physical barrier for those pathogens to basically not get any deeper into those deeper tissues. We're also going to have several antibodies known as secretory antibody A's or immunoglobulin A's that's going to act on most of those intestinal surfaces in groups that I don't care you know this name, but known as GALT tissues. These are gut-associated lymphoid tissues. Basically, we just have really close immune system functions right following along the digestive tract. And some of these you've maybe heard of before. Some of these GALT tissues are the tonsils, Peyer's patch in the intestines, and the appendix, and then there's some other ones as well, but those are the big 3. We also have muscular walls that surround most of the digestive system that are going to go through peristalsis, or basically this kind of forward pushing movement. That's mostly to help us push food through the digestive tract, but it's also going to help push microbes along as well so they don't sit in one spot for too long and get a chance to kind of take hold in any one area. At the same time, a lot of those fluids that are going to be dumped in by those accessory organs, those digestive fluids and those enzymes, a lot of those have antimicrobial properties. For example, saliva has lysozymes in it, which job is to break down different bacterial membranes. Stomach acid itself has just a crazy low pH. Same thing with bile. Its job is to help break down some membranes. So all of these kind of work together, not only to help with digestion, but also breaking down any microbes that get in there as well. So I don't care that you memorize any of these numbers, but the human body has about 10 trillion cells that make up our body, and we have about 10 times that number of microbes just in our digestive tract, just in our intestines and our stomach. So we have a ton of normal microbes in the digestive system, several hundred species in the mouth, several even in the stomach, which we thought for a long time was sterile because it has such a low pH, such a high acidity. Turns out, nope, there's over 100 species that live there naturally. There's several species in the small and large intestines, and those are usually okay. But again, sometimes we get pathogens in there, and that's what makes us sick. Now, the accessory organs, those are sterile with no normal biota. So our salivary glands, our liver, our gallbladder, and our pancreas should not have microbes in them. So we said that there are tons and tons of microbes. Some of those are going to cause diseases, right? Some of those are pathogens, but there are lots of benefits to those numbers of microbes as well. For example, normal microflora are associated with healthy weight. If you disrupt your microbiome, like if you take antibiotics and wash out your normal microbes, chances are you bring back microflora that's not exactly as it's supposed to, and we've actually linked that to obesity. So especially if you took antibiotics as a kid, especially if you took several antibiotics as a kid, like if you had kind of yearly or, every couple of years had to take antibiotics for whatever, chances are you might be more obese than you should because your gut microflora might be messed up. Same thing, there's lots of nutrients that wouldn't be available to us without the help of these microbes help breaking them down. A lot of plant materials are made up of cellulose, which we can't break down by ourselves, but we have microbes that live in our gut that can, so we get those nutrients. Some vitamins we can't make by ourselves, like vitamin K and B12, microbes make those for us. And then plus they give the benefit of having good microbes there. If they're grown up big and strong, then the bad microbes have an even harder time kind of getting a hold in those areas. Okay, so starting with different diseases, we're going to start with a big group of diseases known as diarrheal illnesses. Of course, these are ones that are going to cause diarrhea. Diarrhea is basically defined as having 3 or more loose stools in a 24-hour period. But you usually have other symptoms as well, like fever, abdominal pain or cramping, nausea, vomiting, and dehydration. Not always, but sometimes you have other things associated. Problem with this usually is the dehydration factor, and so we try and treat these things usually with fluid and electrolyte replacement. We'll also see some examples of infections versus intoxications. So infection is where you actually have the growth of a pathogen. Intoxication is going to be the ingestion of a toxin made by a microbe, and that's what's going to cause these really fast symptoms. So if you ingest a microbe, it's anywhere from 12 hours to 2 weeks before you see any symptoms. If you ingest toxins, if you ingest enough of them, it can be anywhere from 1 hour to 48 hours before you start seeing symptoms. So it's a much quicker process. So diarrheal diseases, they're almost always transmitted in contaminated food and water, what's known as the fecal-oral cycle. Usually this can be broken with things like proper sewage, disinfecting of drinking water, proper food preparation and storage. We'll see those are kind of the big 3 that we'll deal with. And although a lot of these symptoms are going to be the same, it is important for us and public health agencies to know which microbes are actually causing the disease in different areas, because some of these are going to require treatments in order to fix, some will resolve themselves by themselves, and then some can actually be made worse with treatment, like some microbes, like if you take antibiotics, they release those endotoxins, and it can actually make the whole process worse in the long run. So starting with salmonellosis, or just an infection of salmonella. This is specifically a bacterium known as Salmonella enterica, enteric meaning the intestinal system. So again, transmission through that fecal-oral cycle or vehicle of some kind of contaminated food, usually contaminated poultry, sometimes egg or milk products. You can also get this if you've ever heard of just getting salmonella. That comes from handling pets, usually reptile or amphibian pets, and then not washing your hands before you go to eat something or touch your face or something. Symptoms for all these are going to be pretty standard with just a few kind of key note differences, but you'll have fever, you'll have the abdominal pain and cramping, vomiting, diarrhea that can sometimes be bloody in this case. Pleasant. Usually you recover in a few days. Mortality rate for this is not very often. It's usually less than 1%, and those are typically due to septic shock caused by an endotoxin. So a little toxin gets into the bloodstream and just kind of goes haywire, but usually not a fatal disease by any means. Prevention is basically just making sure your food is properly cooked and properly stored. So having pasteurized dairy products, cooking foods thoroughly, and washing your hands. Just basic hygiene, essentially. Pausing on the diarrheal, since we're talking about salmonella, I thought I'd kind of take us out of diarrheal diseases and talk about typhoid fever real quick, which is also caused by a salmonella bacterium, specifically Salmonella typhi in this case. Transmission is the same through fecal-oral route. Typically, the bacteria then, once it gets into the body, it can actually get inside those phagocytes that, remember, their job is to kind of go around and Pac-Man up, womp, 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 chew up and spit out bacteria. But these bacteria have a special coat on them, so they don't get chewed up and spit out. They just hang out inside the phagocytes, and then they use those phagocytes as basically like a shuttle bus to get all through the body. So symptoms for typhoid fever are a prolonged fever, and then liver and gallbladder damage. It does have a fairly long incubation period though, anywhere from days to a couple weeks before you start seeing symptoms. But once that fever hits, it can last anywhere from, again, a couple days to even several weeks with this fever. And the whole time, you can be a carrier in your gallbladder, secreting this microbe and possibly getting other people sick. About 1 to 3% of patients that get typhoid fever end up becoming long-term carriers, where they harbor that salmonella microbe in their gallbladder, again, just spewing out more microbes for people to possibly get sick. We actually talked about someone, if you remember Typhoid Mary or Mary Malone. She was actually the one that was going around cooking and getting people sick with typhoid fever because she was a carrier. So nowadays we don't see very much of typhoid fever. It's typically a random case here and there, especially here in the US. But even worldwide, incidence rates have gone pretty far down compared to where they were. Salmonella, on the other hand, or salmonella, those actually have spiked. Those bacterium have gotten better at kind of hiding and making people sick. And so we're actually seeing more of those than we used to. Okay, our next diarrheal disease is shigellosis, or Shigella. So this is caused by Shigella species of bacteria, specifically ones that produce a special toxin known as the Shiga toxin. The Shiga toxin's only function is to cause inflammation and bleeding in the intestinal system. So transmission is again fecal-oral route or direct contact. This one is a very, very easily transmittable disease. It takes as little as 10 organisms or 10 microbes to make someone sick. Versus if you noticed earlier from salmonella, it takes several 100,000, sometimes up to 1 million microbes to actually get salmonella versus only 10 microbes for Shigella. So symptoms for this one, especially with that Shiga toxin causing bleeding, you always have bloody diarrhea, which is known as dysentery, plus the fever, nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, and cramps. Recovery for this one is a much longer period than salmonella. Recovery can take up to a couple weeks, and mortality rate is much higher as well. Up to 20% of patients end up dying of Shigella. And that's mostly just because of that dehydration route. So prevention is good hygiene and sanitary conditions because, again, it's that fecal-oral route. So if you don't have contaminated water, contaminated food, you generally won't have this big issue. You can also get a diarrheal disease from E. coli, specifically a strand of E. coli that underwent horizontal gene transfer with a Shigella species. So it's Escherichia coli or E. coli that can produce that Shiga toxin. So this is specifically called Shiga toxin producing Escherichia coli, or STEC. And then, of course, other E. coli can cause a couple diarrheal diseases as well, but the one with the Shiga toxin is the worst. So overall causative agent, just the bacterium E. coli, some of those strains with that Shiga toxin. E. coli is commonly found in humans and animal intestines. There are actually some strains that we have to have in our body because they do certain jobs for us, but it's these specific strands that can make us sick, like the ones with the Shiga toxin. So transmission is usually ingestion of contaminated materials or undercooked food. Particularly beef is most common, but it can be several other types of meats as well. Specifically, the E. coli strand with that Shiga toxin can also produce a symptom known as HUS, hemolytic uremic syndrome, which we'll talk about here in a second. Prevention for this, like pretty much all of these, is good food hygiene. Make sure you wash your hands, making sure food's stored properly and cooked properly. Okay, those symptoms. So pretty standard so far: fever, bloody diarrhea, abdominal cramps, vomiting. But again, you can also have that HUS, that hemolytic uremic syndrome. Basically, this causes an inability to urinate, and then also a loss of blood because we're losing it through the intestines with that bloody diarrhea. So you end up with loss of blood flow to upper parts of the body like the face and the cheeks. Because you're losing blood, you're losing that oxygen, those nutrients, you have an overall tired and weak feeling. Eventually, you'll actually end up with kidney damage and kidney failure also. You can also end up with having some neurological symptoms like blindness, seizures, and stroke. That's mostly due to a lack of blood flow to the upper part of the body, to the brain specifically. But usually those serious symptoms are only seen in people that are kind of weakened immune systems, so the very young and the very old. Next, we have an infection of Campylobacter. This is a bacterium known as Campylobacter jejuni. This is actually the most common bacterial cause of diarrhea in the U.S. Transmission, again, is that fecal-oral route of ingesting some kind of contaminated food or drink. It's especially common with unpasteurized milk or undercooked chicken, but again, you can get it from several things. You can also get infected if your pets are infected and then you have like some kind of contact with their infected stool. Again, pretty easily transmittable. It takes fewer than 500 bacteria. It's not as easily transmitted as Shigella, but still 500 bacterium is nothing. Symptoms: fever, diarrhea, some with possible blood, abdominal cramps and pain, and then headaches. This can last for about a week, but sometimes goes over 2 weeks. One of the big unique pieces of symptoms for this is that every 1 out of 1,000 cases leads to Guillain-Barré syndrome, or GBS. This is actually a neurological kind of autoimmune disease that can cause paralysis. It's pretty sudden and it usually clears up on its own, but not always. And actually, this is one of the most common causes of GBS. There are a couple other things that can cause it as well, but about 20 to 40% of cases of GBS are from Campylobacter infections. So prevention would be making sure, again, good food, it's cooked well and pasteurized, and avoiding contamination, washing your hands, good hygiene. Next, we have Clostridium difficile, or C. diff infections. So this is actually unique in that it's a super infection usually. So you usually get a C. diff infection because it's naturally found in some people, and then when you take some kind of antibiotics, it kills off most of your normal microbes as well as whatever you were trying to treat. But C. diff can go through that endospore process and can basically hide until the antibiotics are gone and then start growing up big and strong again. Then they have no one else to compete with, so it causes a super infection. These are pretty common with nosocomial infections or hospitalized patients, as well as nursing home residents. Besides being hard to get rid of because of the endospores, C. diff is also pretty damning because it produces toxins that cause necrosis of the intestinal wall, or basically cell death of the intestines that eventually starts to rot away. So the colon becomes really inflamed, and then gradually those inner layers start dying and kind of sloughing off or falling off. So you end up with these little like membrane-like patches called pseudomembranes. If it's not stopped, eventually the bowels become so thin that they can perforate, and then you can have death as a result of that. So this is showing those pseudomembranes. So in A, we have what a healthy colon is supposed to look like, and then you see in B and especially C there, these huge pseudomembranes where basically that's the wall of the intestine kind of dead, has no blood flow left to it, and those start falling off in chunks in the intestines and the colon, and making that wall really thin. Next, we have cholera infections. These are caused by the bacterium Vibrio cholerae. These are more common in underdeveloped countries, but we do have some cases in the US. Vibrio cholerae does produce a toxin known as the cholera toxin, and again, that will cause some kind of unique symptoms here in a second. Transmission, ingestion of contaminated water in this case, especially in endemic parts of the world. Places like the US, it's less likely to have contaminated water. It's more commonly spread through contaminated food, or by asymptomatic carriers, like someone already has it and then they're passing it on, but that's less common. Most likely it's some kind of contaminated food source. Symptoms for this are vomiting, secretory diarrhea, which just means it's very watery, and then rice water stool. You're welcome. Essentially what happens is that toxin, that cholera toxin, breaks down the mucus lining of the intestines, so you lose that in the stool as well, and it creates this kind of clumping effect. You're welcome. Some side effects of those symptoms, especially just losing so much water, is that you end up having low blood volume. You can also have acidosis, potassium depletion, muscle cramps, severe thirst. Your skin and eyes get kind of sunken and flaccid. Eventually, if this continues, it can lead to a coma or convulsions and possible death within 48 hours. So it's very quick. This is a pretty scary disease with a mortality rate of 55 to 70%. It is treatable. It is preventable because we do have a vaccine for it. It's really only given in areas where cholera is endemic, or if you're going to an area where cholera is around, you can get it if you're traveling there. But you can also have just proper sewage treatment and water purification. A lot of the times those can get disrupted though if you're in an area that has like earthquakes and things. Those can break up those infrastructures, and that's when you tend to see huge spikes in cholera. We also have some Vibrio species that do not cause cholera, specifically Vibrio vulnificus and Vibrio parahemolyticus. These are more common in the US than the cholera species, so we're including them as well. Typically you get these from contaminated seawater or from eating contaminated shellfish. We're actually seeing numbers of these infections rise, and they're assuming that this is because of three main factors. There's an increased demand for shellfish as people are getting better paying jobs. They're eating more like lobster, crab, things like that we weren't eating in previous decades. We're also seeing increased awareness, so we're getting better diagnosing from doctors because we know it's a thing now. And then global warming is having its hand in it as well. Basically, because the water is warming in different areas, we're seeing bacteria spread further than they normally would, so they have a larger habitat, which means they can contaminate more water and more shellfish. Really, these infections are not deadly for most people. It's just those immunocompromised patients, like the very young, the very old, and anyone with some kind of immune system failure. Cryptosporidium, this is a protozoan organism that can cause diarrheal infections. The problem with this one is that because it's a protozoan, it's one that can undergo that encystment process where it can make itself into a cyst, making it very hard to kill. This is a zoonotic disease where you typically get it from livestock, but it's still that fecal-oral route, so you get it with contaminated food or drink from feces from livestock. Here in the US, we actually have most of these outbreaks, about half of the outbreaks from this particular protozoan are from swimming pools that are contaminated with the Cryptosporidium spores or live protozoans. This is because chlorine typically isn't enough to destroy the cysts, so it can stay in the water. So just to skeeve you out from public swimming pools even more. And then typical symptoms of diarrheal disease: fever, diarrhea, severe abdominal pain and cramps, headache, sweating, and vomiting. There are also several viral diarrheal diseases. We're just going to look at two, rotavirus and norovirus, and we're just going to know a little tidbit about both of them. So rotavirus is by far the most common viral diarrheal disease, and norovirus is the second most common, at least here in the US. For rotavirus, the transmission is that fecal-oral route for both of them, or you can get it through contaminated food and water for both of them. For rotavirus, you can also pick it up from fomites. For rotavirus, there is a vaccine available. It's just not widely used. And then symptoms, really for most people, part of the reason why the vaccine isn't used regularly is because it is just a diarrheal disease. Diarrhea, fever, vomiting, possible dehydration. Typically, it's really only dangerous for infants that have that really low immune system still. That's when they can possibly have such bad dehydration that they can go into shock. Norovirus, on the other hand, typically this lasts a little bit longer, where you have diarrhea for a couple days, typically 3 to 5 days, mild fever and vomiting. Treatment for both, just like any other diarrheal disease, is just rehydration and those electrolytes. You don't need to know this by any means. I just think it's interesting that rotavirus is most commonly passed around from restaurants or catering. So it's not usually something that we have issues with a cookout or something you do in your own house. It usually comes from a public area. Okay, our next set of diseases is food poisoning. So this is where you have symptoms of severe nausea, frequent vomiting, and diarrhea. And then typically it's labeled food poisoning if someone else that had the same meal as you, someone that was, in your group or at the same restaurant, has the same symptoms within 1 to 6 hours of having that meal. Typically, symptoms are caused by preformed toxins. So this is where we're talking about intoxication versus infection. So symptoms are from the toxin, so they're going to act very, very quickly. Typically, again, within an hour or so of eating that meal. There are several different microbes that can cause food poisoning, but usually it's one of three: Staphylococcus aureus, Bacillus cereus, or Clostridium perfringens. All three of these, I should say, produce toxins that are fairly common for food poisoning. Every once in a while, though, you do get it from a non-microbial source, like fish, shellfish, or mushrooms that either aren't cooked properly or they have some other type of bacteria in them. So just a brief look at where it's more common to find those three bacteria if they're causing food poisoning. So starting with Staphylococcus aureus, this is more common with things that are either really sugared or have a lot of salt in them, but not always. So you find it, for example, in a lot of custards or pastries or sauces. You also find it in some processed meats. It's very common in chicken salad. That's more because usually chicken salad is made and then kind of left out for a few hours, so it starts growing really, really fast. And you also find it in ham now and then. Typically, all of these are just contamination from handling and then being left unrefrigerated for a couple of hours. Things like, banquets or cookouts or picnics, things like that. Bacillus cereus. This is a microbe that's naturally found in soil, so it's commonly found on things that come out of the soil, like a lot of vegetables, other products that deal with the soil. This one actually produces two separate toxins. One is a diarrheal and one is emetic, which just means it causes vomiting, so you get a twofer for that one. Lucky you. This one's more associated with cooked meats or veggies, and that's typically where you get the diarrheal toxin. And then fried rice, for some reason, seems to be the most common, where you only get that emetic toxin. Now, you can certainly get both, but for some reason, fried rice, it has more of that. Whatever is in fried rice seems to support that specific toxin. And both of these are, again, kept out for long periods, typically just left on warm, where it's not hot enough to kill the bacteria, but just enough to kind of stir it up and let it start growing. And then Clostridium perfringens, this is more common with animal flesh, and then as well as vegetables more like beans that just haven't been cooked thoroughly. So those were all acute diarrheal diseases. Now we're going to look real quick at chronic diarrhea infections. This is just basically diarrhea that lasts for more than 2 weeks, longer than 14 days. Sometimes this is an infectious cause, sometimes it's not. There's some examples of those infectious agents down there. Most of these will be protozoa, but there is E. coli in there, or a special strain of E. coli. And then you can also have some non-infectious things like ulcerative colitis or irritable bowel syndrome or IBS. We, of course, are just going to worry about the microbial causes. So there's those 4 we just mentioned. So really, same thing that last time I've shown tables like this. Don't worry about the epidemiological features, just kind of the generic information we generally look at. So that E. coli strand, the enteroaggregative, just means upsetting of the enteric system or upsetting of the intestines. That one's a bacterial specimen. The rest are all protozoans. Pretty much all of these will transfer through fecal oral route or vehicle of some sort. The only one that's special is the one protozoan, the 3rd row in there, Giardia lamblia. I always stumble over that name. That one's sometimes passed from direct and indirect contact as well. Prevention for pretty much all of these is just proper hygiene, both of whatever you're cooking and of yourself, washing hands, things like that. The E. coli strand in the beginning there, it has a little question mark because it seems like no matter what we do, this E. coli strand just kind of pops up randomly there and there, here and there. So we're still kind of learning about that one a bit. Okay, that's it for the diarrheal diseases. Now moving on to other diseases of the digestive system, starting with diseases inside the mouth with dental caries. So this is caused by Streptococcus mutans, which is a bacterium that typically forms biofilms and creates a polymicrobial infection with other microbes in the mouth. The reservoir is exclusively humans for Streptococcus mutans. The other microbes can come from a variety of places, but we'll just stick with the reservoir for Streptococcus there. Transmission is endogenous, which means this is a normal flora that just kind of gets out of hand in our body, typically from like not flossing, not using mouthwash, not brushing your teeth properly. This is actually the most common infectious disease in humans. So symptoms are basically these microbes get together and they start breaking down sucrose into dextran, so a type of sugar into another type of sugar that's actually kind of acidic, and it starts hardening and forms dental plaque. Then they become, in that biofilm or that plaque, there are microbes that are no longer touching air because they're in the bottom of that biofilm, so they become anaerobes. Those anaerobes then start producing more acid, which breaks down the tooth enamel and will eventually cause the teeth to start rotting away, like you see in all these charming pictures. Prevention for this is mostly good oral hygiene. Make sure you brush and floss twice a day. You can also use anti-cavity fluoride mouthwash twice a day. And then if you have issues with it, you can start restricting that dietary income of carbs, specifically sucrose and other refined carbs. Treatment, unfortunately, is if you get early signs, you can start again with that anti-cavity fluoride mouthwash. And that's at the very early signs. If it gets too far, though, you have to have oral surgery to remove the teeth if they're too damaged, which all of the ones we just saw, way too damaged. So this is just showing that breakdown. So we have a healthy tooth on the left there, and then you can start to see how the decay starts on the outer surface of the tooth and just starts working its way deeper and deeper. Typically by the time it gets into the dentin and the pulp, those deeper layers of the tooth, that's when you start getting the pain and sensitivity, and just basically you have to rip the teeth out, or at the very least crown them depending on how bad it is, and block off that entryway. Next, we have periodontal disease. This actually starts kind of in stages, starting with gingivitis. Gingivitis is just an inflammation of the gums from a variety of bacteria, typically caused, again, by poor oral hygiene, not flossing is the biggest one, where plaque starts to build up, like you see in the image there, between the little toothers. Then, if that continues, it will eventually turn into periodontitis, which basically means you've just upset the teeth themselves. So bacteria move and start infecting the root tips of the teeth, start breaking down the tissue that supports the teeth, and eventually this will result in loss of teeth, because like you can see in steps 3 and 4 in the image there, that gum tissue around the teeth wears away, falls down, exposing the lower bits of the teeth, and then they can just fall out, because there's really not much holding them in there. Next, we have mumps. This is caused by the mumps virus and is transmitted by respiratory droplets. Typically, this starts as actually a upper respiratory infection, and then it eventually gets into the blood, where those virus particles will eventually make their way to the salivary glands, like you can see in the image there. These cause them to basically swell up huge, and it causes the entire neck and jaw to start swelling, which is bad enough, but you can also have complications where the virus can actually get in to other organs from the blood, so it can start causing organ damage to pretty much anywhere in the body. We've seen even brain damage and heart damage from it, but it's more commonly in things like the pancreas or the liver or the kidneys. Luckily, there is a prevention. It's that MMR vaccine, the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine. This is just showing that swelling nature, and you can see especially on the top right and the bottom left there, that huge swelling of the one side of the jaw and neck. Luckily, again, we do have the vaccine. We are seeing more cases of mumps recently, in recent years. Again, this is due to anti-vaxxers and the anti-vaccine movement, because this was the specific vaccine that was listed in the article that said vaccines cause autism, which again is 100% not true. But so we're starting to see this. Typically when we do see it is when we get a bunch of kids that are unvaccinated together, like in college dorms or going into army barracks, things like that. College dorms is the biggest one. I live near, or used to live near U of I, University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana, and we had like 3 years in a row outbreaks of mumps in college dorms. So unfortunately, we're seeing this come back. Next, we have gastritis or gastric ulcers. This is caused by Helicobacter pylori, which is a type of bacterium that can live in the stomach acid. Transmission for this is usually respiratory droplets, saliva, or fecal oral. So we'll see an image of this here in a second, but essentially what happens with this microbe is that it colonizes in the mucosal lining of the stomach, which we have to protect our actual stomach cells from the acid that's in the stomach. And so that mucosal lining's job is to basically keep the acid from burning our own tissues. This microbe gets in there, starts eating away that mucosal lining, so it starts causing the stomach acid to hit the inside lining of the stomach, which allows the stomach acid to kind of eat away at the cells of the actual stomach. So symptoms for this are gastritis, which just means kind of like inflammation of the stomach, eventually will lead to ulcers, and can even lead to stomach cancer if it's left too long. Treatment, luckily, is there are antibiotics for now. We're starting to see resistance in some strains of Helicobacter pylori, but for now we still treat it with antibiotics. So this is just showing that process of eating away. So on the left there you can see the stomach with the little ulcer, and that's caused, if you look to the right, you have that line of mucus layer, and you can see the bacteria, the little green worm looking guys, basically just eat away that mucosal layer, causing that stomach acid to start chewing away at the actual epithelial cells. And then here's some actual images. So you can see in the top two and the one on the bottom left, you can see the ulcers. The one on the bottom right is actually a perforated ulcer where it was eaten away so much it actually punctured all the way through the stomach lining. Next, we have hepatitis. So we are going to look at the microbial causes with the hepatitis viruses. We'll have hepatitis A, hepatitis B, and hepatitis C strains, but hepatitis can also result from drug or chemical toxicity like alcohol abuse, things like that. It can also happen from a couple other viruses that we won't look at. We're just going to focus on the hepatitis viruses. And there's actually other hepatitis viruses as well. We're just going to focus on A, B, and C because they're the most common. So overall symptoms is you'll start with cirrhosis, which is just an inflammation of the liver. This will eventually cause jaundice to be your first noticeable symptom. Jaundice, if you don't know, is a yellowing of the skin and eyes. This is due to a buildup of a product called bilirubin, which is a pigment that's found in bile that the liver usually breaks down. But when the liver's all inflamed with cirrhosis, it's not functioning properly, so it causes that to build up, creating that yellowish tint. You also typically see really dark colored urine, as well as abdominal pain and frequent vomiting. So this is just showing that jaundice, especially in the image here, you can see that yellow tint to the eyes, but again, it's the eyes and the skin as a whole. Here we're also seeing the cirrhosis, so you can see what a healthy liver looks like versus cirrhosis. That entire liver is inflamed. And if this goes on too long, you have chronic hepatitis building up to cirrhosis. Eventually, this will lead to liver cancer, which is that carcinoma of the liver cells. So now looking at the differences real quick between hepatitis A, B, and C. So all viruses, all hepatitis viruses, but modes of transmission, prevention, treatment, things like that vary a little bit. Again, don't worry about the epidemiological features, just there for your information if you're interested. So hepatitis A is the one that can transmit from fecal, oral, or a vehicle. The other two are typically from blood contact or vertical contact. Hepatitis B can also transmit through direct contact, usually through sexual contact. Typically, the further you go, like A, B, or C, is the worse the hepatitis gets. So hepatitis A is actually a pretty mild infection, B is more severe, and then C is the most severe. This is mostly due to those virulence factors. There's really not any for hepatitis A. Hepatitis B, it can go latent, so it can kind of hide, especially if you're trying to treat it. That's bad. And then hepatitis C is the worst one because it can actually break down your own immune system, which of course is bad for a number of reasons. There is a vaccine for both hepatitis A and hepatitis B, but not for hepatitis C as of yet. And for right now, there are treatments for all of them, although some are not as productive as others. Another thing to note is the incubation differences. Hepatitis A and hepatitis C happen relatively quickly within, a few weeks or so, but hepatitis B can actually appear up to 6 months after being infected. Okay, and then our last section for this chapter is going to look at helminth infections. Remember, these are infections from parasitic worms. Usually these are all going to be transmitted through fecal oral routes, but some of them we'll see can actually penetrate directly through the skin, which is terrifying. For all of these, at least part of their life cycle will be in the intestines of the host. We, of course, are going to be looking at the ones that get into humans, but most of these helminths have multiple hosts during their lifetimes. Typically, when we have the host for an adult worm, it's known as the definitive host, or like the kind of end game host. Sometimes this can be accidental, sometimes it's not. For pretty much all of these, there are no vaccines. There's really no preventative measures, except in endemic areas you can take prophylactics, which just basically means like medication that you can take once or twice a year. We don't typically have very many of these because we don't have a whole lot of endemic helminths. But this is essentially the same thing like if you give your pet like heartworm medication, which you should. You do that generally like once or twice a year, maybe every month, depending on what brand you're using. That's essentially the same thing that's happening here. Treatment for these is either anti-helminth drugs or surgery, depending on how bad it is and where it is. So one thing that's important to note for helminths is the different types of life cycles. There are 4 that we'll have, and we'll refer back to these with the different specific helminths we'll look at. So starting with cycle A on the left there, this is where the worm is going to develop inside the intestine of the host, and then eggs are going to be released from the host's feces into the environment. Those eggs then are ingested by the next host, where again the worm will develop. For cycle B, here we'll have immature worms that get into the host and then they will fully mature in the intestines. Again, we will release eggs through feces. Those larvae will hatch and begin development in the environment. Typically, infection from this happens through skin penetration. For example, like hookworms, they can go directly through the skin. Ooh, terrifying. Cycle C, This one involves multiple hosts where the adult is going to mature in human intestines. Eggs will be released into the environment. Those eggs will then be taken up usually by some kind of grazing animal like a cow, like you see in the image there, or goats, sheep, things like that. Sometimes horses, but we don't usually eat horses. Usually it's some kind of livestock animal that we eat. Once that livestock animal has taken up those eggs, they will hatch and start forming little larval forms that will go into encystment and will usually hide in the meat of that animal, like you see in the image there. Then when we slaughter the animals and eat them, we retake in those larval cysts from the tissues. And then last one, cycle D. This is where the eggs are again going to be released from the human. Humans are then infected through ingestion or direct penetration of larval phases. So like baby worms that we either eat or drink on accident, or again, they can go right through the skin. No, thank you. So we're going to break our helminth diseases down into ones that the main symptom is causing intestinal distress, like diarrhea, vomiting, things like that, pain in the abdomen, and then we'll look at another set here in a second. So we have 4 with intestinal stress as the primary symptom, starting with pinworms or enterobiasis. This goes through cycle A transmission, where we take in usually eggs of the organism, either on vehicle, food, water, sometimes fomites, or self-inoculation, where you get them under like your fingernails or on your hands. They're very, 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 very tiny. So really prevention for this is just being very clean. Luckily, there is treatment for this. If you do have someone in your household with pinworms, it means pretty much guarantee everyone in your family has pinworms. Typically, besides like the general symptoms, you also get an itchy butthole, and that's because sometimes the worms will actually leave the anus. Pleasant. That's typically how like parents figure out that kids have them. This is actually one of the most common infections. It is the most common nematode infection in the U.S., with over 40 million cases every single year. Next, moving on to whipworms. So this is also cycle A, where generally you ingest the eggs of the worm. Can also go that fecal-oral route. This is actually found pretty commonly in soil, so it's very common to get it from eating like vegetables that weren't cleaned or cooked thoroughly, things like that. An issue with whipworms is that they can burrow, which means that they can invade other areas of the body besides just the intestines. So getting rid of them is a little bit harder. They can also have some other symptoms like bloody diarrhea, pain. You can get crazy weight loss. If they get into different areas, you can add more symptoms depending on where exactly they get. Prevention, again, is just hygiene and sanitation, making sure you're washing your hands, washing your food, cooking your food thoroughly, things like that. Next, we have the fish tapeworm. This goes through cycle C and almost exclusively is transmitted through consumption of raw or undercooked fish. So it's sometimes known as the sushi tapeworm as well. So the biggest prevention for this is just making sure to thoroughly cook the food. This is actually the largest tapeworm that's known to cause disease in humans. Another feature that can cause is anemia. It can actually cause a lack of red blood cells and oxygen. And this is mostly because it's actually taking blood samples as it's eating, and because they can grow so large, they can grow up to 30 feet long. Yes, 30 feet, 30. It can cause anemia in the host. And then our last ones, these are our Hemnolepis species. We have 2 different ones, 2 sets of tapeworms here. More commonly called a dwarf tapeworm and then a rat tapeworm. You don't have to know those common names though. These grow through cycle C as well with vehicle ingestion. You can also get it from ingesting insects, which I don't know about you, but I also try to avoid, but you know, to each his own. And then that fecal-oral route. Biggest prevention, just like pretty much all of these, is hygiene and just keeping your environment clean. One of them also lives in the intestines of rats, which is why it's called a rat tapeworm. So trying to, again, stay away from rats if you have an environment, like if you have an infestation or if you have like a barn or something that has them in there, it will be in the rat feces. So trying to stay away from things like that, keep those, again, environment clean. So our next group of helminths are called ones that produce migratory symptoms. So this basically means that you typically ingest a larva or egg of whichever species we're looking at. They go into the intestines, then they mature in the intestines, and then they can actually get into the blood and lymph system and travel to different areas of the body, eventually making their way up to the upper respiratory tract, and then going into the mouth, nasal cavity to be swallowed again, putting the adult worms back in the intestine again. So they migrate literally throughout the entire body just to get back to where they started. Because of this, though, we usually have more than just intestinal symptoms because they're getting into all these different areas. So you can get mostly a lot of inflammatory reactions, as well as things like pneumonia if they get near the lungs, things like that. Our first one is a group of Toxocara species. There are several species in this group. All of these go through cycle A. The most common mode of transmission is zoonotic disease, so it comes from animals, typically from animal feces, and then gets ingested by us. Most commonly, these are actually in dog or cat feces, so household pets, which is usually how we come into contact with their feces. So biggest prevention for this one is hygiene, making sure to wash your hands thoroughly, clean up after them, things like that. One of the distinctive features of this one is because of those migration symptoms, it can actually go up to the just lost the word, optic nerve, and can actually cause blindness. It can kind of sit behind that eye and blind the patient. This is very common, especially in dogs. It's estimated that about 100% of newborn puppies are infected with this at some point, and then about 14% of people in the US have been infected at some point, just again, because dogs and us live in very close proximity. This is another one of those neglected parasitic infections. Next, we have the intestinal roundworm. This is actually the most common roundworm infection. Goes through cycle A again, typically ingesting the eggs through some kind of vehicle like soil, fecal, oral. You can also have it in fomites or self-inoculation, where you have it on your hands or under the fingernails and then ingesting it that way. This one can be especially problematic if the worm gets too big or if it travels to different areas, because it can actually cause abdominal obstruction because the worm gets so big. It can also start causing hypersensitivity, so you have wherever it travels to, basically you have an immune response or an allergic reaction, which can be problematic, especially if it gets near the airways. It can cause those to swell shut. Biggest prevention, like pretty much all of these, is just basic hygiene, washing the hands, washing food, washing all the things. And then our last one are hookworms, two different sets of species for this one, both following that cycle B life cycle, where you ingest eggs from a vehicle, typically from the soil or on a fomite. Again, these ones can produce hypersensitivity, so you can have that immune reaction wherever they move to, and then abdominal obstruction, because again, they can get so large. Basic sanitation for pretty much, again, all of these. One distinctive thing about this is that it can penetrate through the skin, so it can actually leave whenever it likes. It can also penetrate through internal layers of the skin, so it can leave the intestines at any time and go anywhere else, just like all of these with those migratory symptoms, but most can't usually penetrate through the actual skin layer. Cysticercosis, this is an infection from a tapeworm, Tinea solium. This follows that C life cycle where humans eat animal flesh that has the worm eggs or the actual baby worms themselves in it. Typically only if you ingest the baby worms, the larva, does it cause the disease, but sometimes the actual eggs can as well. Just depends on how close they are to hatching. Symptoms for this are generally liver swelling or malfunction, because basically we're getting all of the debris from the worm and all the stuff that it's kind of causing loose is getting picked up by the liver. You can also get some neurological diseases as well, or neurological symptoms, I should say, where the worm can actually get into the brain and start causing seizures. Fun. This is actually one of 5 neglected parasitic infections in the US. It's estimated that there are tens of thousands of Latino households living with this in the US, mostly because it's not very common for us. It's not something we generally look for because we don't generally deal with tapeworm infections. So our doctors don't really know to look for it. So here's some images just to haunt you. So on the left, you can see those brain images where you have the worms in the actual brain. And then on the right, it's actually showing the worm itself. The top image is showing the quote-unquote head of the worm, where you have the little suckers and then the hooklets. That's how it latches on to the inside of the intestines and just kind of hangs on for dear life. And then the bottom is a full-grown tapeworm. It's all coiled up. Adult tapeworms can get upwards of 5 meters long, which if you don't know, a meter is like roughly 3 feet. So that's a big ass worm. No thank you. And then our last disease is schistosomiasis. This is an infection of a blood fluke that can actually cause liver disease. So this one follows that life cycle D that we looked at earlier. For this particular one, the blood fluke can actually burrow through intact skin if you get into water that has the worm in it. Gross. Typically, the way it gets into that water is from an infected host urinating or defecating in the water, which is also gross. So it's a double no. Humans in this case are the definitive hosts, and then this one does have an intermediate host or another host that's specifically snails. So this typically begins with enlargement of the liver or spleen, which is that hepatomegaly and splenomegaly. Eventually will lead into liver disease. Then on top of it, the worm can actually burrow through different tissues. So if it gets to like the central nervous system or the heart, it can cause even more issues, specifically huge granulomas or big clumps of immune cells. One of the biggest problems we have with this particular helminth is that it can actually hide from the immune system. It does this via a quote-unquote cloaking mechanism, where basically it covers itself with proteins found in our blood, so our body really can't see the fluke. It just sees our cells kind of all around this worm, so it can actually create a chronic affliction. It can create this issue long term, which is how we get to liver disease, because it's constantly having issues. This is actually one of the worst, or I should say most common parasitic diseases after malaria. It's estimated that there's over 200 million cases worldwide. So this is just showing that little blood fluke there. So you have an infected host, gets eggs into the water, either through urination or defecation. Again, ew, don't do that. Then those eggs get ingested or burrow through a snail as their intermediate host, where they grow up. Then they become juveniles and go back out into the environment, where they can get burrow through the skin into that human host again and start causing all kinds of issues. And then last but not least, of course, our same images. So here we have all the diseases of the gastrointestinal tract that we talked about, as well as what types of microbes cause them. And then our deadliness versus communicability. For a lot of these, really the only ones that we see have our major jump are mumps and rotavirus. For the most part, this is our first kind of break from that trend, where usually if it's something that's not very deadly, it's very communicable. For a lot of these ones, it's not very deadly and it's not easy to pass. Okay, that's it for chapter 20.